Hello and welcome to the International News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. Thanks for tuning in today. There is no change and there will be no change. The words of United States Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken. This was said as a follow-up to the United States' formal response to Russia's demands towards the Ukrainian crisis and towards NATO and the United States. Now, we've been covering this crisis this entire week, and as we've reported on, Russia has had two main demands for it to remove the more than 100,000 soldiers that it has amassed alongside Ukraine's borders, raising tensions in the region that has been embattled since the 2014 annexation of Crimea. Now, Russia has stated that it will remove these soldiers if the United States and the NATO alliance meet two fundamental demands. Number one, being permanently banning the entry and closing the door for a potential NATO membership of Ukraine. And number two, being the United States and NATO's withdrawal of any troops, assets, or weapons in former Soviet Union or Warsaw Pact countries, even if they are signatories of the NATO contract and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, if they're member states. Now, both NATO and the US, in their written response, stated that these are completely non-negotiable, that they will not meet Russian demands, and at this point, they can fundamentally be called an ultimatum. Russia is saying that if you don't do these two things, we will not remove our soldiers, and tensions will continue to increase. Now, the US and NATO refusing to meet Russia's ultimatums is nothing that was unexpected. No one, literally no one expected the US or NATO to actually accept these demands. And for good reason. Publicly, the US and the foreign diplomats that have been representing the US and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization have stated multiple times, we are not going to meet these demands. This written letter was simply a formality to get the next steps of what's going underway. And if this is starting to seem more like a boring diplomatic process to you than a war or a potential conflict, that's because it most likely is. Now, while Russia has stated multiple times that if its demands are not met, that tensions will increase and that Russia will keep increasing its presence across the Ukrainian border. Now, Russia has denied having any ambitions of making any attacks or invading Ukraine's territory. Now, that actually is turning out to be true. It seems that way at the very least. While the written response by the US government and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, there were two written responses, one from the US, one from NATO. Both were separate and submitted separately, but virtually they said the exact same thing. Both of these written proposals and written responses stated that they will not meet Russia's two main demands. However, these written responses were extensive, and they're not public yet, so we can only speculate on what's on there, but they offered many other potential solutions for Russia's security concerns in Europe. And Russia has stated that this is not optimistic, the US response. However, they've also stated that it leaves an opportunity for dialogue. Now, the Russian foreign ministry's responses have been relatively vague and open-ended. And the reason for this is because the official response and the final word on what Russia does in response to the United States response comes from Russian President Vladimir Putin. But nonetheless, it does seem, based on the words of Russian Foreign Secretary Sergei Lavrov and the Russian press secretary for the Kremlin, that Russia seems prepared to talk with NATO and talk with the United States on making other concessions, not necessarily relating to these two demands. Now, in addition to this, we talked yesterday about the separate peace talks that were occurring in Paris between the leaders of Germany, Russia, France, and Ukraine on finding a potential solution for this problem. Now, this meeting and this diplomatic envoy was not actually attended by the presidents or the heads of state of these nations. They were attended by high-ranking diplomats or high-ranking officials close to the leadership of these nations. Now, Volodymyr Zelensky, who is the president of Ukraine, has stated that he would like to see a diplomatic meeting between the heads of state of these nations. So President Vladimir Putin, himself the president of Ukraine, the president of Germany, and the prime minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson. Now, Russia has stated that it has no business and no interest in meeting with President Zelensky. And it has said that it will meet with no Ukrainian president until the Ukrainian president is an individual willing to accept creating stronger economic ties with Russia and to create a more acceptable foreign policy towards Russia. And this comes only days after the United Kingdom has accused Russia of actually creating these tensions with one main goal in mind: replacing Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, it should be noted that Volodymyr Zelensky is a massive supporter of joining both the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and eventually the European Union. Now, the reason that Russia invaded Ukraine in the first place and annexed Crimea was in 2014, one of the former presidents of Ukraine, who was extremely pro-Russian, was ousted. And after this ousting, Russia lost a key partner in its foreign policy making and geopolitical sphere of influence in Ukraine. It felt that it had no other option but to invade and annex Ukraine and to allegedly support separatist movements in eastern Ukraine that have been occurring. Now, we say allegedly, but it's been relatively well documented, and it's been alleged that Russia has been providing these separatist forces and insurgents in Ukraine with weapons and even soldiers coming in unmarked uniforms since 2014. Now, the war in eastern Ukraine is still raging on, the Russo-Ukrainian war, and the Russian separatists that don't want to be a part of Ukraine. That war is still occurring, and 14,000 people have died since 2014. Of those 14,000, 3,000 have been civilians. This war has had a very real cost of human life, and it's affected Ukraine very negatively. However, Russia does not want to meet with the president of Ukraine whatsoever. In addition to this, the Ukrainian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dmytro Kuleba, has stated that when the United States has any form of contact or connection or conversation with Russia regarding Ukraine, that it should contact Ukraine first and last. Now, the United States has not responded to this whatsoever, and it seems that the international community is going to continue leaving Ukraine out of the diplomatic talks that are actually going to make the key decisions that affect and determine the future of Ukraine as a country, its self-determination, whether or not it can be a NATO member state, or whether or not Russia actually invades Ukraine. Now, other proposals have been mentioned by the United Russian Party. Now, the United Russian Party is the party of Vladimir Putin and the party of the Kremlin, the one that has been controlling Russia for the last few decades, or last 2 decades at the very least. Now, what the United Russian Party has recommended in response to, number one, the NATO buildup of soldiers and the NATO shipping of weapons to Ukraine has been to formally send weapons, openly and publicly send weapons and resources to pro-Russian separatists in the eastern Ukrainian regions. Now, Russia has been doing this for many years, but to publicly do so would be a statement of open support for these separatist movements. Another proposal, which is relatively unlikely, but interesting to mention nonetheless, was to place Russian soldiers in the Western Hemisphere, more specifically in countries like Cuba and Venezuela. Now, this most likely will not happen. Number one, because I fundamentally do believe that this crisis is going to find a diplomatic solution between the United States and between the Russian Federation, and also including Ukraine and the other NATO allies. But number two, even if it didn't, Cuba and Venezuela are two nations that have, in recent years, been making attempts to end their policies of isolation and to normalize their relations with the United States. While tensions have been high between Cuba, Venezuela, and the United States, respectively and separately, nonetheless, these nations today have been showing policies and willingness to cooperate and to have economic trade with the U.S. They would most likely completely decline any form of Russian soldiers being sent into Cuba or Venezuela. That fundamentally is not going to happen, and if Russia were to make that ask publicly and get denied, it would be an embarrassment. So we're probably not going to see this crisis going into that direction, and that would be a bad one. That would actually expand the crisis to leaving just Europe and Ukraine to going into the Western Hemisphere, making this a global one. Now, this isn't a global crisis fundamentally. Before, and I myself have predicted that this is actually just a geopolitical conflict between the United States, who in its key interest is expanding its foreign interest and its sphere of influence, while Russia is simply trying to consolidate its previous sphere of influence, which was the former Soviet republics and the Warsaw Pact. But the reality with Russian foreign diplomatic statements as a response to the United States' response to Vladimir Putin, saying that they're willing to continue a dialogue, seems that Russia is more interested in consolidating regional power and not regional power on the level that it can be influential globally. Now, to understand what I'm saying, you have to look at the entire global arena right now. The world is typically used to a bipolar power structure where there's two great nations that are duking it out in a rivalry. This is what we saw in the United States versus the Soviet Union. Russia used to be this second great power that was providing a bipolar counterbalance to the United States. Russia has, in recent years, been completely eclipsed in terms of economy, in terms of political influence, in terms of pretty much every sector except military advancements by the People's Republic of China. Maybe fundamentally, the leadership of Russia, including Vladimir Putin himself, recognize that Russia is no longer going to be a major global player. But that does not mean that Russia cannot be a major regional player. And fundamentally, maybe this is just an attempt for Russia to consolidate its regional influence. And if Russia's desires for security and for consolidating its sphere of influence in the region can be met and provided for by the United States and NATO allies, this can actually open up a door for cooperation and an alliance with Russia and the United States. Now, maybe that's too optimistic, and maybe that is kind of too peaceful of a solution. We will see as time turns out, but when you look at Russia's options, it seems that cooperation with the West and finding a diplomatic solution to this problem is in everyone's interest. And these are not my words. These are the words of former Russian president and currently the deputy head of the Security Council of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, who also served as prime minister. He has stated that hopefully that this problem and that this crisis can be resolved diplomatically between all parties, and that any form of conflict between Russia and NATO is a terrible and horrifying thought that no one wants to see. And it would be. Fundamentally, war is not productive for Ukraine. It would not be productive for Russia. It would not be productive for the United States. Economically, in terms of cost, potential cost of human life, and socially. Many of these countries, most of the countries involved in this crisis are democratic nations. And even the ones that aren't, Russia. Russia is technically democratic, but let's be honest, it's not, okay? It's just not. Russia is not a democracy. Even Russia, Vladimir Putin, if he goes to war with Ukraine and let's say major economic sanctions are levied against him, as has been promised by the West, could create massive instability and economic chaos at home within Russia. Even dictators have to listen to the will of the people. And if they upset their people just enough, they will be overthrown. And the power balance of their country can completely and fundamentally change. So every nation here has to look out and see what's in its best interest. And just from a fundamental and even a realist perspective, just where I'm coming from, it seems that the best solution is to find a diplomatic one, which ensures that the United States continues its sphere of influence in Europe with the allies it's already established with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, where Russia is allowed to consolidate and ensure that American interest does not expand into its own geopolitical sphere of interest, while also ensuring that Ukraine has a right to sovereignty and self-determination. It should be stated that while Russia has no interest, most likely has no interest in invading Ukraine, it is very clear that Russia has a key interest in influencing and controlling Ukraine's foreign policy decisions, which is all you really need to control a nation. Russia has no interest in influencing the domestic policies of Ukraine. Russia's key interest is to ensure that Ukraine, foreign policy-wise, listens to Russia. That probably won't happen, but there are other methods that Russia's security concerns and its consolidation as a regional power can be met without hampering on Western expansion or Ukraine's sovereignty. But maybe I'm just being too optimistic. If you disagree with me, let me know in the comments. Tell me what you think. Like, dislike, comment, subscribe, and join our growing international community. I look forward to seeing you next time.